The best place to hide the truth is in the pages of a book.
Maybe we should just read. Maybe we should just read.
Welcome to Hayes Reviews. Hello, everybody. This is Nick, creator of Hayes Reviews, and we are back for another live stream, live reading tonight. It's Friday, the 17th of April, 2026. I hope you are all doing well. We've got Frank and Mellingtons. We got Tammy and Heidi and Franzi Yuan 5759 in the chat. YouTube has a weird thing now where I can't see the name you've given yourself. I can just see the handle that you either chose or were given when you signed up to YouTube in the first place. But shout out to everyone who's tuning in live. It's nice to have you all here. Pretty quiet over on Rumble for now, but that's all good. That's to be expected. We're getting things up and running again. We had a good long run of live streaming every single week for many, many months, and then I had a break. And this is only my third live stream since I returned from that break, and I'm not expecting massive crowds. And of course, it's Friday night, and the weather's good here in England, at least. And it's hard to compete with all the fun activities and things that people get up to on Friday nights. But here we are, and this is what we're doing. And so it's amazing indeed to have people tuning in live. If you're watching on the replay, also equally good to have you here. Everything's looking fine from my end. I think you can all hear me and see me, and that means we can get on with today's show. We're going to be continuing with our reading of Foundations, Their Power and Influence. We've got a new chapter. It's about education and radicalism. The last chapter we did was all about social sciences and how it's not really a science. Trying to boil down the predictability and management of populations to basically questionnaires is ridiculous, because it removes all the subjectivity of the human experience. It removes all the things that we feel and think and believe, and all those ephemeral, abstract things that we know to be real because we talk about them all the time. We have songs and plays and poetry and theater productions and movies and films and books and novels and all this kind of stuff talking about these ephemeral, non-tangible aspects of our reality. But then the social scientists come along and they tell you, we're going to gather some data, we're going to set up some microphones and listen to you when you think you're not being listened to. We're going to ask you to fill out a few questions. Please complete this survey. It'll only take a few minutes. And then all that data becomes policy. It becomes government policy. It becomes corporate policy. It becomes curricula in the schools. It becomes rules, regulations, laws, permits, permissions, all that good stuff, all that bureaucracy that we all enjoy dealing with every single day of our lives. This is where it comes from. It comes from the social sciences. How best to manage people, how best to guide and lead people's behavior so that they will be predictable, so that they will not rise up and overthrow the money masters who control this planet, or the shills in the political parties who lie to us every single time when we elect them, supposedly, if you believe in that. We don't rise up because we're managed, we're controlled. All these threats are in place. There's a monopoly on violence held by the people who put on a uniform, call themselves police and soldiers and military. They follow the orders of the government. They tell us they're here to protect us, but it's not really true, is it? And all this is codified and put into place by academics, academicians, people who just write books and think about ways to control other people for a living. And these books and these recommendations become policy, and these policies become reality for the masses. And these academicians, these writers, these thinkers, these quote-unquote experts, these quote-unquote scientists are funded by foundations, the large tax-exempt philanthropic foundations. These engines for social change, these vehicles for mass man and woman manipulation. They tell us they're doing it for our own good. They're telling us they just care so much about us. These incredibly wealthy families, these captains of industry, these titans of profit and capitalism and business, they just care so much about the little people who they've screwed over and exploited and ripped off their entire lives. They just have a change of heart, and suddenly they want to give all their money to making life better for us. Isn't that a heartwarming story? It's like Scrooge, isn't it? It's like A Christmas Carol. Suddenly, this miserly, horrible, exploitative, heartless, cruel capitalist decides he's got to be kind. He has to buy turkeys for orphans and disabled children, and he has to give his money away and be good to everybody. And that's the story of these philanthropists. If you can believe those kinds of stories, then maybe you can come over and buy a bridge that I've got to sell you. But this is what we're going to be continuing reading about tonight. And this is one of my favorite books we've ever read on the channel. We have learned a lot about how the system really works. This is an overlooked part of the system for many people. I'm sure for a lot of people, if you said, what about those tax-exempt philanthropic foundations, they wouldn't really know what you're talking about. You might say, what about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which poured money into the BBC and the Guardian and other UK media outlets during the Big C event, 2020 to 2020, what was it, 3, 4? The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation buying up prime time slots on our television and our nightly news, smirking and grinning and waving his hands around, saying the next pandemic's really going to get their attention. Talking openly on his TED Talk about depopulation, bringing one of these numbers close to zero. And they all have a good chuckle about it because they all know what he's talking about. And yet he's a philanthropist, and all the money that pours out of his foundation into the coffers of the BBC and the Guardian and other outlets as well, not just those. That money is just there to fund the impartial, objective reporting that goes on in those institutions. It's going to be a night of selling lots of bridges, I think. But this book is fantastic, and what it's revealing to us is that there's a history there. There's a history of foundations. They've been influential and powerful and wealthy for quite a long time, and they've been under suspicion for quite a long time as well. Prior to the Reese Committee, which is what this book's about, there was the Cox Committee investigating the foundations for the same sort of reasons. Now, that Cox Committee, it says at the beginning here, didn't really get the job done. Kind of gave up, kind of fizzled out. But the Reese Committee went a bit further and got, in the words of the people who work in these foundations, admissions to what their real purpose was or is. You know, because a lot of these still exist. They're still in operation today. They're still going. They're still doling out cash, funding very specific quote-unquote scientists and academicians and writers and thinkers. And what we learned in the last chapter was how, for the most part, these foundations are funding left-leaning communist, socialist sympathizers. thinkers and writers. This is one of the big revelations of the book, I think, and one of the reasons why the members of the committee became the target of attacks and disparaging reports in the left-leaning media outlets. We learned about the funding of authors. The example in the last chapter was a gentleman called Stuart Chase, who put out quite a few books, but one of the big titles that he put out was The Proper Study of Mankind. And it was a bestseller, 50,000 copies or something. And it was to popularize social science, quote unquote social science, to make it seem like a legit way to do things in the mind of the public. So that when the expert shows up on your screen in your nightly news or on your radio, as it might have been at the time, and makes some announcements that they've collected the data and now you all have to change the way you live. You have to stay at home, stay 6 feet apart. You have to wear a piece of cloth on your mouth at all times, no hugging, no handshakes, step off the pavement into the street to avoid walking past another human being coming in the opposite direction. All these decrees and edicts that came at us were justified by and done and given to us in the name of science. And I was thinking earlier when I was out on a little walk, and on that walk I found £5 on the floor, which was really good. Nice little sign. Always good to find a bit of money. But it made me a bit sad because you can't even buy a pint of beer for £5 these days. Not where I live. But I was out on my walk and I was thinking about the reason that science is such an effective and powerful mind-controlled device is because people think all science is objective and empirical and free of bias and free from superstition and free from belief. Oh, that terrible word, belief. And they just make this sweeping assumption that everything done and passed off as science and labeled with science must therefore be factual and reality-based. And that is not the case. Science, just like religion, just like culture, just like stories and narrative, can be used to deliver packets and payloads of terrible information that is false and harmful and misleading, incomplete. Just because somebody has a white coat and some letters after their name and a certificate in a frame on their office wall doesn't mean that they're objective, doesn't mean that they're free from bias, doesn't mean that they are going to deliver the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth to you when you interact with them or have any dealings with them, right? But we're trained and we're conditioned to believe that, oh, science, yes. Science is rational. Science is empirical and evidence-based, always. And that's not the case. You can capture science. You can pay scientists to find whatever conclusion you want them to find. And in fact, there was a very good podcast that I shared in the Telegram group recently. Let me just scroll up a second. Dr. Ferdinand Santos III. He was on a podcast called Maverick in the Machine. He has a Substack, which is a brilliant name that he writes under on his Substack. He's called Unstabinated. Unstabinated. Let me pull it up for you. I'll show you real quick. And you can guess what the title of his Substack is referring to. And some of you out there in the audience tonight might actually also be unstabinated. You might not have submitted and accepted and given your consent to the stabbies back during the Big C event. But here he is. This is his Substack. And I don't like the AI art. Of course I don't. But, you know, he's probably not got much time to make beautiful pictures in Canva himself. So we'll forgive him for that. But he talks about science as a religio philosophy or scientism. right? The new religion, scientism. And this is the important thing, because there is science. There is a scientific method. There are natural sciences. That's what we learned about in the book. There are natural sciences, the study of things that we can measure. And we can make hypotheses, and we can test these hypotheses with experiments, right? That's one thing. But then there's fake science, scientism, where it becomes a religion because people just believe in it and they worship at the altar of these white coat new priests of the new age. And I thought this gentleman's appearance on the Maverick and the Machine podcast was really, really good. He talked about the moon landing. He talked about the NASA at length. He talked about the Apollo missions and the propaganda surrounding that whole event, the lead up to it. And on his Substack, I haven't dove into these articles yet, but apparently they're pretty science heavy. He goes into the mathematics of some of the claims made by some of the, like by NASA, for example. He goes into the history. Very articulate, very good place to help you overcome this mind virus, which is scientism. And you can see here, there's a lot to get into. It goes on and on and on and on. Looks like he's been doing this for quite a while. I wouldn't recommend starting here. I would recommend going to the podcast episode and listening to him, because he's really articulate. So let me give you this gentleman's name again. He is called... Do you know what? I should show you the podcast, shouldn't I, really? And then you can look it up, because it fits really well with the readings of the last two episodes of this show. So there you go. The moon landing debunked, and scientism is not science, with Dr. Ferdinand Santos III. Maverick and the Machine. I believe this doctor has been on Dellingpole's podcast. I haven't listened to that. I don't really like Dellingpole as a host and an interviewer. But if you type that name in, I'm sure you can dig up the episodes and the places where he's been. And he did a fantastic job of applying actual science to some of the claims, some of the mythology and the stories, the narratives, the psyops that many people don't question. Many people just accept without giving any kind of questioning to, right? So there you are, the Maverick and the Machine. That was that just came out in February, so it's quite new. And I think he's been on a second time. I think he's been back on this show. There he is, talking about the recent Artemis 2 event. So I don't know what this guy's show's like. I haven't listened to any of the other episodes, so I'm not endorsing this person and everything that he does and says and talks about, right? But this one episode here, I do endorse Ferdinand Santos III. So there you go. Scientism, brought to you by philanthropic foundations. And how do they work? Well, very, very wealthy, crazy wealthy, and unimaginably wealthy people, they want to hold on to that wealth, right? And they want to use that wealth to do what? Well, to get more wealth for themselves, to get more control, more influence, to secure the goodies that they've accumulated over a lifetime of screwing people over and lying to people and being cutthroat and brutal and psychopathic in the business world. Because I don't think you can quite get to those dizzying heights of wealth ethically. You know, maybe that's cynical of me, but I don't think that's possible in this current reality. So you amass all this wealth by ripping people off and screwing them over and undercutting them and doing whatever you have to do to get ahead. And then you want to preserve it. You want to make sure it stays in the family. You want to make sure that you hand it off to the people who are aligned, who maybe you are related to, or at least people that you choose to hand it off to. Right. What you don't want it to do is be taken by the government and taxed and used, you know, to pay for things that benefit those non-wealthy people down at the bottom there. Ugh, those horrible poor people. I'm just getting shivers saying it. Those poor people. So to avoid paying tax on this massive amount of wealth that you've accumulated, you stick it into a tax-exempt foundation, right? This was an early, well-known, well-accepted function of tax-exempt foundations is once you put the money in there, the government can't get their hands on it. And then you appoint people you know, trust, perhaps your sons, perhaps just a trusted advisor, to be the executors of that money. And then they get to decide where it goes. And you, at that point, you've got control over it still. Okay, you can't go and buy yourself a Ferrari and a nice, expensive painting or a manor house somewhere in the country, but you can invest and dole it out in ways that you know are going to have effects on people, on society in the future. So you fund the ideologies that are most likely to lead to a consolidation of your power and influence out into the future. Excuse me a sec. I'm going to cough. And this way, the same families and the same monopolists can stay in control. People can be guided and managed through the output that is produced by these institutes, these research groups. And you can control and guide it and steer it, because when you are sitting on a massive pile of cash, putting demands and conditions on that cash and who gets it, then people are going to fall in line. People are going to study the things that you tell them they have to study. They're going to study in the way that you tell them they have to. Like one of those ways is that we learned about in the book is that very few lone wolves got funding, right? It would be groups. It would be teams of researchers that would get funding. It wouldn't be that genius, outlier, polymath savant who has the brain power and the insight to really tip the balance maybe in the favor of the general population. No, they wouldn't get the funding. It'll be the group of researchers, the yes men, the smiling and nodding and collectivist type people who are going to hold each other to account, who are all going to stay in the same lane, because this is what we do. Naturally, we're kind of herd-like creatures. We like to belong to the tribe. And so not many of us have the bravery, the courage, the intelligence, the intellect to step out of it and say, look, everything this tribe believes is stupid and it's all wrong. And I'm going to show you why. And I'm going to stand up and say that, even if it puts me at risk of excommunication and being kicked out of the tribe, which means certain death, to our reptilian brains. Not many people have the cojones to do that. But the ones who do, the ones who will stand up in the face of overwhelming peer pressure and say, no, this is wrong, those are the people who, we are told at least, make change. Those are the people who stand up to illogical beliefs and erroneous worldviews, right? We're told to venerate them in the past. But then the ones who do it in the present day, we have to vilify them and, lock them up and call them far-right extremists, deplatform them, debank them, and just make sure nobody can be heard. None of them can be heard, right? It's kind of a bit of a contradiction there. Like, people who stand up to the dominant mainstream paradigm in the past, heroes. People who stand up to the dominant mainstream paradigm in the present day, far-right extremists, and we should ignore them, because they're probably racists and homophobic and anti-Semitic and climate deniers and moon landing deniers and gender deniers and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's weird that it's a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? It doesn't quite follow logically. So those those outliers, those mavericks, those savants, they're not going to get funding because with funding, they might actually topple some of the architecture that is in place that enables the dominant few to continue their scams and their cons, ripping everybody off, keeping everybody under their thumb, assaulting people's biology, people's spirituality, people's relationships, economic security, just really making life a grind when it shouldn't be a grind. Life should be, apart from avoiding getting eaten by predators, life should be full of joy, spending time with people you love, doing things that bring you joy and love and make you feel good and allow you to express your creativity in whatever unique way has been given to you by, the creator, bestowed upon you. You have the ability to create, right? Made in the image of the creator. So, but instead of that, we've got to pay our taxes. We have to run on the hamster wheel faster and faster and faster just to keep our heads above the rising water as our money is devalued, as our taxes are spent on murder and death and destruction and mayhem and carnage, as our lives are more restricted, more surveilled, more controlled than perhaps ever before. And we're told that this is the best time to be alive and we're enjoying the most freedom ever. And we should be grateful. Now, I'm not saying don't be grateful. There's a lot to be grateful for. But what I am saying is they don't make life easy. And these foundations put a lot of money into making life a grind and hard for the rest of us. And like I've said many times, you don't put money into things unless you expect some kind of return. Not when you're at this level of wealth. Not when you're Rockefeller rich, right? Not when you're Bill Gates level of wealth. You don't expend anything unless you anticipate some sort of return on that investment. So you got to think about that when you're told that this money is being doled out for our benefit, for these philanthropic reasons. No, definitely not. So good evening. That's my little ramble off the top of my head, meandering intro to tonight's reading. We're going to get into the book very soon. I'll read a few comments before we do. We've got little Ronnie Cooper here. Good evening. I haven't said hello to you yet. And Lee as well. Good evening to you. Heidi says, follow the science. I like that. SOYENCE. Science. Yeah. And the Gates this is Franzi Yuan says, the Gates Foundation advert a few years ago titled The Decade of Health said they will eliminate cancer by 2030. I wonder how they're going to do that. Are they just going to kill all the cancer patients? It's when they say they're going to eliminate cancer, it doesn't mean they're going to cure all the people with cancer. It probably just means they're going to kill all the people with cancer and then say, look, there's no cancer because everybody's dead. That would be my guess. I think that's probably the strategy they've got lined up. We'll see. Well, we've only got 4 years to find out. Franzi Yuan also says, materially rich, morally bankrupt. Yeah, exactly. And the other side of that is that we're also conditioned that to be poor is like noble, and to be poor is morally rich, So you get a lot of TV shows and films that show the rich, greedy people as the problem. And this is like a kind of socialist, communistic type of programming, because it makes you just blame the rich. Well, who are the rich? Well, it's anyone who's got more than you. It's subjective. It's relative to your position in life. And just because someone's got more than you doesn't necessarily mean they're evil and psychopathic and cruel, right? It is possible to get ahead, not Rockefeller rich, but certainly just to get ahead a little bit in life through hard work, industriousness, making good decisions, and providing value to other people in the market as a fair exchange. It is possible to do that. So it's not a case that everybody who's got more than me is the bad guy. And the government needs to take some of their stuff and give it out to me and my friends. you know. But we are programmed and conditioned to think like that. There's lots of TV shows which have that programming layer to them, you know. So you got to be wary of what you allow into your brain. Oh, I just saw we got the history of propaganda in the chat. Good to have you here, sir. And if everybody, if you haven't yet been over to the history of propaganda on YouTube, go over there, check it out. You will, if you like what I do, you will be so impressed. You will love what is being done over there. It's awesome stuff. Really well referenced, well researched, great presentations, detailed, lots of books, lots of quotes, lots of old pictures and diagrams. And yeah, you got to go over there. And it's great to have you here watching. That's cool. Lee says, how many people is ideal for a tribe to live as a trustworthy community? Is it possible now? I'm going back to my cave to have a think, and it's not Plato's one. I actually have a possible answer for that, which is something I've heard about, which I think is called Dunbar's number, Dunbar, Dunbar's number. And he studied like the size of mammals' brains, and he found a correlation between the size of either the brain or a certain part of the brain and the size of the like groups that they would live in, these mammals, different mammals. And of course, humans were mammals. And he found that for our size brain, and what you will find in tribes that are not civilized, you'll find it's roughly 100 to 150 people. That seems to be the sweet spot. Any more than that, and then you get power struggles, you get conflict, you get gangs and groups forming and different tensions. You know, but you wouldn't want to go too much fewer than that, because then the population is not going to be self-sustaining. And so something like 100 to 150, you can look it up, Dunbar's number. And, you know, this kind of tracks if you think about your own life. I mean, maybe not. You might be hermits. You might be a little antisocial like me. I don't keep a lot of company, apart from the people very close to me. But if you had to list everybody you know, you probably would not get much further than 150 people. And I mean know as in, like, you talk to them regularly, you know a little bit about their life, you're interested in how they're doing, you make some sort of effort to stay in touch, right? I don't just mean people you've met. Obviously, we're all on Facebook now, and we've got hundreds of thousands of friends. We've never had so many friends. But actual people who you care about, you know, you're in touch with, maybe they would answer the phone if you rang. Maybe they would come to your aid if you needed help, right? You might not even get anywhere near 100. You know, I don't think I would. But that's a starting point for you to research an answer to that question, Lee, is Dunbar's number. Frank says, Ed Griffin has a book out on cancer. My copy on its way. That's good to hear. Yes, he does. That was one of I think it was the first book that he wrote, actually, and I don't have a copy of it yet. But one day. I remember going to there was a smoothie stand in Bristol on a marketplace, and they had all the fresh fruits and vegetables and things, and they were just grinding them up into smoothies and selling them to people. And they had a copy of his cancer book there, just on the counter for people to pick up and read and browse. I thought it was really, really good of them to do that, just to leave it there lying around to educate people on, you know, because this is such a huge industry. We're told no matter how much money we throw at this cancer problem, we just can't seem to get it under control. We just need more money and more money and more money and more money. Well, perhaps there are fixes and cures and antidotes and ways of treatment that have been suppressed by this big network of funding and scientists and scientism, right? That has its roots in the foundations. Maybe they don't want you to know about some of these very simple ways that are free to improve your health. Things like grounding, things like sunlight. The scary sun is going to give me cancer if I go out in the sun, isn't it? You know, things like sorting out your sleep pattern, getting in tune with your circadian rhythm and your biology, light exposure that ties into sunlight, but the fake lights that we're all sitting under all the time, messes with our hormones and our biology, right? So there's all these little changes we could make to our lives and our routines and our environments that are either free or very cheap. But you don't want to spread that information out too widely, do you? Because there's a lot of money in the pharmaceutical business. There's a lot of money in treatments and doctors and nurses and hospitals and equipment and research and scientists. It's a whole big industry. Tammy says they're developing a vaccine for cancer. Well, I'm not surprised. Is there anything we can't treat with vaccines? Little Ronnie Cooper says groupthink would eventually overtake individualism. In my opinion, Japanese Zen art always depicts the individual as alone, not lonely, and overlooking the populace. Well, that's a point that I hear you. I know what you mean. You get a group together. There's going to be some kind of pressure to align with the dominant ideology and thinking and worldview of that group. Like as I said before, if you step out of line, if you challenge it, if you call it out, you can get kicked out of the group, and then you're on your own. Good luck. Okay, we better get into the book. Otherwise, it's just going to be me rambling and talking to you and responding to your comments all night, which wouldn't be bad. But there are, I'm sure, some people out there who are actually here for the book. So let's get into it. We are on page 139. Let me get this lined up properly. Foundations and radicalism in education. So it's bad enough. It's not enough that they come after the social sciences, that they're funding these left-leaning, communistic, socialistic types of thinkers. But they got to get all that ideology into the schools. And this is where I think the book overlaps with and connects very nicely with Fabian Freeway, the Rose Martin book, because that tells that whole story as well. Fabian socialism, born in England, then exported to America and spread via these small groups, these unions, think tanks, organizations and outfits such as the League for Industrial Democracy, which was mentioned in this book earlier, in the previous chapter, I think. So we got foundations and radicalism in education. Let's get into it. The control of education by foundations. A very powerful complex of foundations and allied organizations has developed over the years to exercise a high degree of control over education. Part of this complex and ultimately responsible for it are the Rockefeller and Carnegie groups of foundations. The largest of the foundation giants, the Ford Foundation, is a latecomer. It is now joined in the complex, and its impact is tremendous. But the operations of the Carnegie and Rockefeller groups start way back. There is little question that the initial efforts of the Carnegie and Rockefeller foundations in the field of education produced substantial and salutary results. Certainly, the standards of our institutions of higher learning were materially improved as a result of the early work of these foundations. Yet the Rees Committee questioned whether their actions were wholly commendable. The reason for this doubt was that coercive methods were used. Dr. Ernest Victor Hollis, now Chief of College Administration in the United States Office of Education, once explained the background of this coercive approach as follows. Unfavorable public estimate of the elder Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie made it expedient in 1905 for their newly created philanthropic foundations to attempt any direct reforms in higher education. Yeah, so that reminds me, one of the things that the earlier part of the book mentions is that another function of foundations is not only to preserve wealth and to pass it on, but it's also to remake the image of the philanthropists, or previously they weren't philanthropists. So you think of Bill Gates, you know, he was a software guy. His company was not indicted. I don't know what the word is, but there wasn't there an antitrust investigation or litigation filed against Microsoft, and he was a software guy, and he was just this nerdy guy who was putting computers out there and all this crappy software and forcing everybody to use it. Although it wasn't too bad in the early days, Windows 98 and XP, not too bad. They were all right. It got much worse from XP onwards, in my opinion. But anyway, at some point, he decided to reinvent himself, reinvent his image, and become a philanthropist who cares about your health and cares about making sure that everyone has equal access to as many injections as they can possibly want in their bodies, right? Because he's just such a great guy. So he reinvented himself. How do you go from operating systems to injections? You know, and John D. Rockefeller did the same thing. He was well known for being this cutthroat, psychopathic monopolist that was ruthless in business and amassed this gigantic amount of wealth. And people were disliking him. People hated him. He was turning armed militias on to peaceful protesters who were turning up to demand better working conditions. And so he had to reinvent his image, okay? And starting a foundation and getting into philanthropy is a way that is done. Now, does a leopard change its spots, or are we dealing with wolves in sheep's clothing? History of Propaganda says, PhD system adopted from Prussia. Nearly all presidents of the universities who first adopted it were Phi Beta Kappa Society. Daniel Colt Gilman was central. Sidney and Beatrice interviewed him 1898. Nice. Thank you for that. Yeah, the Phi Beta Kappa I've talked about. I can't remember which book it was in reference to, but kind of reminds me a little bit of Balliol College in Oxford. A lot of these people, you know, seem to come from the same groups, and certainly the educational institutions and think tanks and societies, right? But yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks for the little tidbit. The PhD system adopted from Prussia, yeah. And now it's supposed to be so impressive. You got this PhD, right? Well, what's the history of the PhD system? Where does that come from? Why is it so well respected? Who created it? Who put it in place? And again, it's to give people this or for those who have these letters after their names, right? Remember, I did a little look at Wikipedia page for Alfred Lord Milner, and the number of letters that he has after his name is obscene. It's so silly. I was making jokes about it, putting LOL and LMFAO in there and BRB, and you know, it's just crazy. But if they give each other these letters after their names, then people think, oh, wow, they must know what they're talking about. And little old me, stupid little old me down here who doesn't have a PhD, you know, I can possibly make my own mind up about this or understand what they're saying. And we get bedazzled, right? We get kind of overwhelmed with awe for these people because they must be so smart and intelligent and brilliant. And we must therefore have to listen to them and follow their edicts and their policies. So great point. Thank you. History of Propaganda says Sidney and Beatrice interviewed the remarkable NY Governor Theodore Roosevelt and the attractive-minded president of Princeton, Woodrow Wilson. And that's in Beatrice Webb's diary. It all connects to foundations. Prestige means to trick or fool, yeah. Like the film, The Prestige, right? The Christian Bale, Hugh Jackman, and directed by Christopher Nolan. It's a very good film if you haven't seen it. It has David Bowie playing the role of Nikola Tesla. But look, we'll get back to the book and crack on a little bit because we haven't even read one page yet. So the method used, therefore, he said, was one of indirection. Quote, indirectly through general and non-controversial purposes. For instance, says Dr. Hollis, there is little connection between giving a pension to a college professor or giving a sum to the general endowment of his college and reforming entrance requirements, the financial practices, and the scholastic standards of his institution. Yet one was tied to the other. It was a case of conform or no grant. When to conform meant bathing in a stream of millions, college and university administrators and their faculties were inclined to conform. Surprise, surprise. About this type of coercion, the committee report said, quote, We question, however, whether foundations should have the power even to do good in the coercive manner which was employed. We cannot repeat too often that power in itself is dangerous. What may have been used for a benign purpose could in the future be used for the promotion of purposes against the interests of the people. It does not write off this danger to say that good men ran the foundations. It is power which is dangerous, power uncontrolled by public responsibility. Yeah, what's the saying? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So continuing. Merely to recognize the satisfactory results of benign coercion, to point to the highly desirable academic reforms for which this coercion was responsible, is not enough. Such a mistake was made by those who lauded the internal reforms of fascism in Italy and ignored the cost in freedom and liberty. Power is in itself dangerous. When we make it possible for financial power to exercise substantial control over education, we endanger our welfare. Perhaps the risk is worth taking in order to preserve freedom of action to foundations, but we should be conscious of the risk and alert to what transpires. The Walsh Committee had heard witnesses testify to the fact that colleges had abandoned their religious affiliations in or before 1915 to conform to requirements established by foundations. Today, school policymakers anticipate the idiosyncrasies and preferences of foundation officials in a manner similarly producing conformity. Yeah, so this word conformity, this is coming up a lot. And this is what this money being doled out produces. Consensus, conformity, uniformity, gradually eroding the individual's ability to act in a unique way, in a way that is specific and particular to them, to express their blend of qualities and characteristics that make them unique. No, that we need to get rid of that. We want people to be predictable, reliable, and easier to control. As History of Propaganda said, the PhD system comes from Prussia, and that whole schooling system comes from Prussia as well, because Prussia needed a system that would make people more willing to do what they're told. And so that's where our schooling system comes from and what it was designed to do. It's like make people sit down and obey and do what they're told without too much fuss or faff or pushback. And it works, it works really well. So continuing. Consider what the Ford Foundation could do with its billions of capital. It could use this monumental fund to promote whatever educational theories a Dr. Hutchins of the moment were to persuade the trustees to support. Footnote. I happen to support some of Dr. Hutchins's educational theories. The fact is, however, that he was a power in the Ford Foundation and did promote his own theories with its tax-exempt money. Whether his theories are right or wrong is beside the point. That the power which he exercised in educational circles could exist through the tax-exempt foundation vehicle is a serious matter. Back to the text here. Nor need it be difficult for such promotion to succeed. The country is full of colleges and universities starving for endowment. The number of miserably paid academicians is legion. Professors have to eat, and universities have to pay their janitors. While it is possible that the majority of academicians and administrators would resist, their aggregate voices would not be as powerful as those of a minority of academicians subsidized in the publication of their writings, and a minority of administrators whose institutions flowered financially. How difficult to resist if pressure for change in educational concepts were accompanied by a persuasive flow of hundreds of millions or even billions. A little Dr. Evil moment there. $1 billion. There's a footnote. It is encouraging that some educators, even at schools which have enjoyed special foundation patronage, are beginning to complain against foundations directing education and educational research. Just before this book was sent to the press, there appeared in the New York World Telegram a report of a lecture delivered by Dean Stephen M. Corey of Teachers College at Columbia University, in which he is reported to have complained that, quote, philanthropic foundations are beginning to shackle educational institutions in their research projects by depriving them of a free hand in deciding the areas to be looked into. Excuse me. Decision making, said the dean, is being taken out of the hands of the educators. The report quotes Dean Corey as follows. It is probably worth noting that within the past few years there seems to have been a decrease in the disposition of foundations to make grants to institutions that had independently arrived at judgments regarding the research they wanted to do. Foundations as donors are coming more and more frequently to designate the problems that they want studied as a result of their gifts. The dean was reported as saying that the trend of the foundations to set the pitch, quote, was most clearly illustrated by operations of the Ford Foundation and its subsidiaries. He said they sought out research institutions to go into problems or practices that the officials thought critical. A pathetic consequence, in the dean's opinion, has been the great amount of time spent by university personnel developing data that conforms to the real or fancied interests of the foundation or government agency. This, he observed, tends to remove the decision-making on research that should be done from the persons who are most intimately involved in the research, the investigators themselves. There you go. That is a very important little bit there. It's the findings are pre-decided, right? The conclusions are dictated, and then the money is doled out, and then the scientists go and rustle up the data and design the experiments to prove the conclusion that they're being paid to prove. That's more like the way it actually works, rather than, as I mentioned at the top of the broadcast, objective empirical science being done, and it's all fact-based and it's just all rational and logical. No, the desires and the wishes of the people with the money tend to be backed up somehow by the research done by the people who receive the money. Isn't that strange? Who'd have thunk it? All right, back to the text here. We're at the top of page 142. There is much evidence that, to a substantial degree, foundations have become the directors of education in the United States. Wow, in the whole country. To what extent this has been brought about by conditions attached to financial support since the early activities of the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations it is difficult to assess. We do know that their first efforts to reform the colleges were only a beginning. Accrediting organizations and other instruments in the form of civic, professional, and school associations were created or supported to implement the reform plans of these two foundation groups. The American Council on Education became their major executive agency. Other clearinghouse organizations, operating variously in higher, secondary, and primary education, and later in the field of adult education, received heavy support. Among them were the National Education Association and associated groups, the Progressive Education Association, the John Dewey Society, the National Council on Parent Education, and the American Youth Commission. So it's all councils, associations, commissions, clearinghouse organizations, right? These intermediary groups that, there's another Substack channel. Are they called channels? I don't know. By a guy who publishes under the pseudonym Escape Key, or ESC, as he types it, Escape Key. And he puts out ridiculous volumes of lengthy, long, detailed essays. I think he uses a lot of LLM tools to get all the information together. But recently he's been focusing a lot on how the Rothschild family has been involved in setting up a lot of these clearinghouse organizations. And this is the real mechanism that shapes the systems and the structures and the architecture that governs our lives and dictates what we can and can't do. It's through this clearinghouse mechanism and the setting up and establishment of clearinghouse organizations. So it's quite funny that this little section we just read here also mentions the same sort of thing. Clearinghouse organizations. And this is part of your standardization. It's part of making everything uniform and conformed. So, nice little synchronicity there. Continuing. While the results of the first phase of foundation operations in education were entirely beneficial, that cannot be said of later stages. Together with an enormous amount of benefit, the foundations were responsible as well for much that has had a decidedly deleterious effect upon our society. Research and experimental stations were established at selected universities, notably Columbia, Stanford, and Chicago. Here, some of the worst mischief in recent education was born. In these Rockefeller and Carnegie established vineyards worked many of the principal characters in the story of the suborning of American education. Here, foundations nurtured some of the most ardent academic advocates of upsetting the American system and supplanting it with a socialist state. That's, there you go. So anytime you see Columbia, Stanford, Chicago, you've got to think Carnegie and Rockefeller foundation influence and money. So we got next section here, the birth of educational radicalism. Whatever its earlier origins or manifestations, there is little doubt that the radical movement in education was accelerated by an organized socialist movement in the United States. In 1905, the Intercollegiate Socialist Society was created under the direction of Jack London, Upton Sinclair, and others for the active promotion of socialism. It established branches in many major colleges and universities where leaders were developed who were to have considerable future influence. Among them were Bruce Bliven, Frida Kirchway, Senator Paul Douglas, Kenneth McGowan, Isidore Lubin, Evans Clark, and John Temple Graves Jr. Robert Morse Lovett, a man with a total of 56 Communist Front affiliations, became the first president of the society. Stuart Chase, selected by the Social Science Research Council to write the showpiece on the achievements of social scientists, was an early writer for this organization. This society was no transient organization. It still exists and operates today as a tax-exempt foundation, having changed its name some years ago to the League for Industrial Democracy. And again, I will mention that is covered in quite a lot of depth and detail by Rose Martin in Fabian Freeway. It started out as the ISS, the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, the ISS, and it became the LID, the League for Industrial Democracy, the LID. History of Propaganda adds that ISS comes directly from the American Fabian League in Boston, and Stuart Chase, the author of The New Deal. Yes. Yes, Stuart Chase, that's the other book he did. One of the other books as well, The New Deal, as well as The Proper Study of Mankind, right? I'll remind people as well that in that previous chapter, when we learned about Stuart Chase and his book, The Proper Study of Mankind, Rene Wormser was telling us that the first and second editions of the book had very different introductions. The first edition of the book gave a lot more about his connections, the other types of socialists and Fabians that he was influenced by and that helped support him and bring that book, into existence. And then they apparently left a lot of that out for subsequent later editions of the book. So I just mention that because I'm always going on about how good it is to get earlier editions where you can, because subsequent publications and can be changed and altered, and they can have things reworded, sections removed. They can judge how people react and respond, and then they can alter the text accordingly. So where possible, if you are collecting books, you got to consider that this does happen. And this is why we're so blessed on this channel to have, like, for example, this is a 1958. This is an early, very original. This is an original copy, I think. It's a first edition, but it's the editorial copy, right? So it's kind of, I think they handed it out to somebody for a review. But you just know that it's a better slice of history. It hasn't been altered and changed, or less likely to have been altered and changed. Now, that's not always the case with all books, right? For example, this one here, Political Ponerology. This is the most recent and up-to-date edition of this particular book by the Red Pill Press. And it's much better than the last one that they put out. This is a 2022. I don't know where the old one is. But I've got an older edition, an older copy of this, and it just doesn't have anywhere near the level of, there it is. So this is the older one, Political Ponerology, and you can see like the difference in the two books. So this one on the left is the older one, and then they massively expanded it for this updated edition. They put so much extra footnotes and commentary and references and bibliography, and they really fleshed it out and made this more recent edition better than the older ones, right? So it's not always the case that the older version, the older editions are always better. So, you got to use a little discernment and think about it. But certainly for the much, much, much older books, you want to consider if you can get hold of an earlier copy, I think, and try and shoot for that. So a little tangent there, but a reminder that Wormser agrees with me on that point. So let's get back to the book, page 143. The movement generated or accelerated by the League was likened to the Fabian socialist movement in England by Mr. Aaron Sargent, one of the witnesses before the Rees Committee. Mr. Sargent is a lawyer who has had considerable experience in special investigations and research in education and subversion. He had been a consultant to the Senate Internal Security Committee in 1952 and represented patriotic organizations in numerous public hearings concerned with educational and other tax-exempt activities. At the Rees hearings, Mr. Sargent cited Fabianism in Great Britain, a book by Sister Margaret Patricia McCarran, daughter of the late Senator McCarran, in which she described the gradual extension of influence of the Fabian idea. Mr. Sargent called the socialist movement in America that propelled by the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, an offspring of the Fabian movement. There's a book I might want to look up as well. Fabianism in Great Britain by Sister Margaret Patricia McCarran. Continuing. The American movement seized upon some of the teachings of John Dewey, who, as Mr. Sargent put it, quote, expounded a principle which has become destructive of traditions and has created the difficulties and the confusion, much of it, that we find today. Professor Dewey denied that there was any such thing as absolute truth, that everything was relative, everything was doubtful, that there were no basic values and nothing which was specifically true. I didn't know that about John Dewey, actually. I didn't know he was a relativist. Mr. Sargent added that with this philosophy, you automatically wipe the slate clean. You throw historical experience and background to the wind, and you begin all over again, which is just exactly what the Marxians want someone to do. Interesting. So that relativism was mentioned in the previous chapter again. It was about how a lot of these social scientists, the way they were approaching things and viewing things, they'd thrown objectivity out and everything became relative. Because when you fill out these forms and these polls and there's all these questions, a lot of it is just subjective, right? It's subjective to you and your experience and your interpretation and what you think and your opinion. And so it kind of makes sense that there would then be a knock-on effect of that would be kind of going down the road towards relativism, which is, as he says here, it gets rid of truth. Nothing can be known. Nothing can be absolutely true. which means there can be no right and wrong, which means anyone can do whatever they like. And it leads you down this road to kind of might makes right and social Darwinism. And it's absolutely fine to screw over the little guy and be psychopathic and claw your way to the top and do what all these maniacs like the people in the Rockefeller family did, to their competition when they were building their oil monopoly. So you can see that they're funding the ideology which justifies their behavior and spreading it out to other people. Yeah. History of Propaganda says pragmatism. Yeah, I've heard some of your talks on that actually. And I got the book, you can probably see it behind me, The House of Truth, on your recommendation. I'm looking forward to getting into that at some point. But yeah, that's quite an amazing site. And I just ordered as well, is it Weimar on the East Coast? Is that what it's called? I just ordered a copy of that the other day as well. I'm really excited to get that one. And Franz Yuan says The First Fabians by Norman Mackenzie is a must-read. So there's another book as well for people if you want to learn a little more about the Fabians. Okay, back to the text. We've got this rejection of tradition carried with it an undermining of the doctrine of inalienable rights and the theory of natural law which underlie our system of government. It has become intrinsic in the liberal philosophy which assumed the Dewey point of view that while there may be fundamental rights which are sacred, they are subject to constant review. In any event, proceeds this approach, some are not as sacred as others, whether or not they may be listed together in the Declaration of Independence and the original Constitution or its amendments. Certainly these liberals believe that the right to private property is only a second-class right, or maybe third class. Mr. Sargent very persuasively told the story of the growth of the radical movement in education. The Dewey philosophy took hold just about the time John D. Rockefeller established his first foundation, the General Education Board, in 1902. The era was one of reform agitation, and there is no doubt that much reform was needed in various directions. But the moderate and sensible reformers of the era were very often overwhelmed and to some extent seduced by a small army of socialists, crypto-socialists and collectivists who took advantage of the necessary reform movement to propel their own radical philosophies and theories of government. These found grist for the mills in the teachings of John Dewey. As Mr. Sargent said, they took advantage of the existing discontent to make considerable inroads in academic fields. The National Education Association became enamored early of the Dewey philosophy. It was at Columbia University, however, the institution in which Professor Dewey taught so long, that perhaps the greatest strides were made in applying this philosophy of teaching. In 1916, the Department of Educational Research was established in Teachers College, part of Columbia University. This department was responsible for the creation of the Lincoln School in 1917, which, to use the words of a Teachers College pamphlet, quote, kindled the fire which helped to spread progressive education. And there's that word, progressive. Progress. Everyone knows that progress is good, right? The same pamphlet noted that John D. Rockefeller, through the International Education Board, donated $100,000 to establish an international institute at Teachers College. It noted as well, a bit of a scratchy throat there. It noted as well that a Dr. George S. Counts had been made associate director of the institute, and Dr. Counts became one of the leading radicals in education. The growing radicalism, which was beginning rapidly to permeate academic circles, was no grassroots movement. Mr. Sargent cited a statement by Professor Ludwig von Mises that socialism does not spring from the masses, but is instigated by intellectuals, quote, that form themselves into a clique and bore from within and operate that way. It is not a people's movement at all. It is a capitalization on the people's emotions and sympathies toward a point these people wish to reach. That's That's a very good quote. I didn't know of that one. I haven't read much von Mises, but yeah, he was on the money there. Communism and socialism is a top-down imposed system. And that's the irony. And that was one of the big questions at the beginning of the book, was like, why do these wealthy industrialists who've made all their money in the capitalist system, allegedly, why are they then funding socialistic, communistic, sympathetic movements and groups? And it seems like a contradiction until you realize that the two systems are controlled and given to us by the same people, and it's part of a managed dialectic, right? If you're not one, then you have to be the other. But there's certain things that both systems have in common, and it's like you're moving. If you want to, I was thinking about this example the other day. If you want to do some really, let's say you try and do some engraving, and let's say you want to engrave. You don't do it with one hand, right? You'll put some pressure on the engraving tool, and then you might put some more pressure with your other hand. And this way you can get a much finer, controlled movement when you have two forces of pressure acting on the tool, if that example makes sense. So this is kind of what a dialectic does, right? Instead of just having this one force doing it willy-nilly, this one side, with all this room for movement and uncontrolled scope for error, if you have the two sides coming in to control it, you can more tightly control with that dialectic, with that two-pronged, two-side attack. So this is why we get so many dialectics. It's always the red team or the blue team. It's the capitalism or the communism. It's the this or the that. It's always these two options, because neither option is true or correct or appropriate or viable. But they both exist because people get stuck then in the middle and can be more easily managed and controlled and pushed, towards, the outcome, the eventual, what would it be? The eventual synthesis, I suppose, to use the thesis, antithesis, synthesis terminology. You need the two first parts to get to the synthesis. So yeah, really good quote there. I like that one a lot. Maybe I'll read it again. Professor Ludwig von Mises said that socialism does not spring from the masses, but is instigated by intellectuals that form themselves into a clique and bore from within and operate that way. It is not a people's movement at all. It is a capitalization on the people's emotions and sympathies toward a point these people wish to reach. And that reminds me actually of what we talked about quite a bit during the Fabian Freeway readings, is that socialism sounds so good. It's all about justice and fairness and righting wrongs and sticking it to the man and distributing to those who have less, So it really does appeal to the idealistic youth. It did then, and it still does today. So continuing, page 146. Carnegie finances a socialist charter for education. Mr. Sargent gave convincing evidence that efforts to use the schools to bring us to a new order, collectivist in nature, followed a plan, and that this plan was supported by foundation money. He cited the conclusions and recommendations of the Commission on Social Studies of the American Historical Association. Big footnote for this little sentence here, which says, in one of his speeches in Congress, Mr. Rees referred to a conspiracy, and his use of this term brought down on his head the anger and ridicule of the liberal press. Yes, conspiracy, you conspiracy theorist. What are you trying to say? Powerful people get together and make plans in order to preserve their power and influence and wealth? Pshaw, ridiculous. While the term was a strong one, Mr. Rees had some justification for using it. Since the preparation of my manuscript, a book has appeared, a reading of which leads one to the conclusion that there was indeed something in the nature of an actual conspiracy among certain leading educators in the United States to bring about socialism through the use of our school systems. All right, everybody, we're getting a book recommendation here. Get your pens out and your pencils. The book is Bending the Twig by Augustine C. Rudd, published in 1957 by the Heritage Foundation Incorporated, a most admirable and illuminating work. Got to make a page note of this, page 146. Bending the Twig. To the extent that the movement to suborn our schools was heavily financed by leading foundations, through the Lincoln School, the Progressive Education Association, the John Dewey Society, units of the National Education Association, and other organizations, these foundations must be held largely accountable for the success of the movement. It is impossible to believe that the countless public utterances of some of these organizations and their leaders, which made their program utterly clear, did not penetrate into the administrative consciousness of the managers of the foundations which subsidized them. So that book again is Bending the Twig by Augustine C. Rudd from 1957. I'll have to look that one up for sure. So back to the text. The American Historical Association is the professional association of the Social Science Research Council. The work of its commission was financed by the Carnegie Corporation to the extent of $340,000. The conclusions was the last section of the commission's final report, produced in 1934. It had an enormous and lasting impact upon education in our country. The conclusions heralds the decline of capitalism in the United States. It does not oppose the movement for radical change. It accepts it as inevitable. Quote, cumulative evidence supports the conclusion that in the United States, as in other countries, the age of individualism and laissez-faire in economy and government is closing, and that a new age of collectivism is emerging. But that is not all. It continues, quote, as to the specific form which this collectivism, this integration and interdependence is taking and will take in the future, the evidence at hand is by no means clear or unequivocal. It may involve the limiting or supplanting of private property by public property, or it may entail the preservation of private property, extended and distributed among the masses. Most likely, it will issue from a process of experimentation and will represent a composite of historic doctrines and social conceptions yet to appear. So that composite, that just means like a merging, a combining, right? Spoiler alert, I have heard that the big revelation in this book is that these organizations, these foundations were working to merge the Soviet system with the American system for this third way, this synthesis. So that's composite's another word for synthesis and combination. Almost certainly it will involve a larger measure of compulsory as well as voluntary cooperation of citizens in the conduct of the complex national economy, a corresponding enlargement of the functions of government. So that's more government, right? More arms, more interference, more regulation, more bureaucracy. And an increasing state intervention in fundamental branches of economy previously left to the individual discretion and initiative. A state intervention that in some instances may be direct and mandatory, and in others indirect and facilitative. In any event, the Commission is convinced by its interpretation of available empirical data, it's just fact. It's just empirical data. It's just science. That the actually integrating economy of the present day is the forerunner of a consciously integrated society in which individual economic actions and individual property rights will be altered and abridged. Whew, quite a quote there. But wait, there's more. The emerging age is particularly an age of transition. It is marked by numerous and severe tensions arising out of the conflict between the actual trend toward integrated economy and society on the one side, and the traditional practices, dispositions, ideas, and institutional arrangements inherited from the passing age of individualism on the other. In all the recommendations that follow, the transitional character of the present epoch is recognized. And a third quote. Just let me check. I didn't skip a page there. No, a third quote from the same source. Underlying and illustrative of these tensions are privation in the midst of plenty, violations in fiduciary trust, gross inequalities in income and wealth, widespread racketeering and banditry, wasteful use of natural resources, unbalanced distribution and organization of labor and leisure, the harnessing of science to individualism in business enterprise, the artificiality of political boundaries and divisions, the subjection of public welfare to the egoism of private interests, the maladjustment of production and consumption, persistent tendencies toward economic instability, disproportionate growth of debt and property claims in relation to production, deliberate destruction of goods and withdrawal of efficiency from production, accelerating tempo of panics, crises, and depressions attended by ever wider destruction of capital and demoralization of labor, struggles among nations for markets and raw materials leading to international conflicts and wars. See, all that stuff does sound really bad. So you can see why people, when you read a list like that, you're like, yeah, you know, that stuff is bad. It would be good if we could find a way to be free of all that and get rid of it. And but then they come along with their solution. It's more of the same. It's just a different way of ensuring all that stuff carries on. The report of the Commission proceeds to say that we must make an adjustment between social thought, social practice, and economic realities, or sink back into a primitive form of life. This adjustment must be made, apparently, in some collectivist manner, for the report, continuing, says that there are many varied theories to use, involving wide differences in modes of distributing wealth, income, and cultural opportunities. I have italicized the verb distributing, which forcefully disclosed the collectivist planned economy objectives of the authors of the report. So it's centralization of control of everything, really, is what they're advocating. If you just let us, the experts, control absolutely everything, there won't be any of this nasty bad stuff that we just listed here. So continuing, but no inferences regarding their intention are needed. They were utterly frank in their recommendations. Teachers must free the school from the domination of special interests and convert it into a truly enlightened force in society. And the Board of Education must have as its objective, quote, to support a school program conceived in terms of the general welfare and adjusted to the needs of an epoch marked by transition to some form of socialized economy. The Commission then discusses the lines along which a tax canon will be made on the problem of applying its conclusions with respect to instruction in the social sciences and the payoff. Quote, as often repeated, the first step is to awaken and consolidate leadership around the philosophy and purpose of education herein expounded. This was a call to the teachers in America to condition our children to an acceptance of a new order in process of transition. As to the nature of this intended order, there can be no doubt. Professor Harold J. Lasky, philosopher of British socialism, said of the Commission's report, at bottom, and stripped of its carefully neutral phrases, the report is an educational program for a socialist America. Mr. Sargent's comment upon the report produced by Carnegie Corporation Money is highly significant. Quote, what these gentlemen propose to do is set forth in their chapter at the end talking about next steps. It says that it is first to awaken and consolidate leadership around the philosophy and purpose of education expounded in the report. that the American Historical Association, in cooperation with the National Council on the Social Studies, has arranged to take over the magazine. The Outlook, as a social science journal for teachers, that writers of textbooks are to be expected to revamp and rewrite their old works in accordance with this frame of reference. That makers of programs in social sciences in cities and towns may be expected to evaluate the findings. That it is not too much to expect in the near future a decided shift in emphasis from mechanics and methodology to the content and function of courses in the social studies. That is the gist of it. This report became the basis for a definite slanting in the curriculum by selecting certain historical facts and by no longer presenting others. Speaking of the selection of certain historical facts, there's a really good TruthStream media video. I mean, there are very, very, very many good TruthStream media videos, but a recent one came out, and it's all about this thing going on in America where signs are being taken down and rewritten and edited to hide basically any information that might make people look bad. It's crazy. I mean, it's so Orwellian and nuts. It's this video here. It's called "Our History is Being Erased." Oops. Just as Orwell warned in 1984. And it's a really good video. It's 45 minutes long. But it's all these signs that are in these national parks being they're problematic now because they make people who are now dead look bad. And so there's this whole movement to rewrite them and take them down and change them. And so you can see here, this is like a wall where these signs have been taken down. The glue's still there, and these signs have all been taken down. And so it's crazy what's going on. I couldn't really quite believe the contents of this video when I first saw it, and it hasn't been out that long. It was 3 days ago it came out. There is a movement to preserve these signs and take pictures and upload them to a website, which she mentions later on in the video. But yeah, popular national historic sites and the problem of, we can't have anything on these signs that makes people sound, that disparages Americans in the past, you know? So it's absolutely bonkers, but it's very much worth your time. It's quite a long one, 45 minutes, but this is where we are at now. This was being funded by the foundations back in, over 100 years ago at this point, 120 years ago even. And this is where it's gotten to. This is how successful they've been. This is how far they've brought this effort. They're incredibly successful, very effective, the gradualist Fabian way. Sadly to say, it works. It does work. It does get things done. That's why they use it, right? That is why they use it. So historical facts being selected, certain facts being left out, still happening. So to go back to the reading, did the Carnegie Corporation denounce or renounce this call for a socialization of America? Indeed, no. Its 1933 to 1934 annual report said this, quote, "Both the educational world and the public at large owe a debt of gratitude both to the association for having sponsored this important and timely study in a field of peculiar difficulty, and to the distinguished men and women who served upon the commission." This reaction of the Carnegie Corporation is most astounding. In his statement to the Reese Committee, Mr. Charles Dollard, the president of this foundation, contended that the conclusions and recommendations of the Commission on the Social Sciences do not advocate socialism. He said that what the authors were accepting was not socialism, it was the New Deal. He attributes their attitude to widespread disillusionment concerning our economic system, prevalent during the years of depression. He makes the further apology that once the funds had been granted, The foundation did not have, quote, the power to censor or rewrite the works produced under its grants. He takes the position that, quote, works will be supported by corporation foundation grants containing views that differ from those held by trustees and officers. Mr. Dollard does not explain the commendatory remarks of the Carnegie Foundation after the publication of the last volume of the Commission's report, nor does he convincingly absolve the Foundation from responsibility for the Commission's work. The grant was not one for scientific research, but one essentially for the development of new principles in education. As such, it supported the formulation of a philosophical value system based on a priori assumptions of goals of education and desirable forms of government and social organization. Such a system might well be supported by reference to facts in the manner in which Aristotle's rhetoric advises the use of facts for the end of persuasion. But the basing of principles on a priori value concepts is meta-scientific. The work of the Commission was not a scientific search, but an effort to persuade America in favor of a new ideal in public life and in education. The support of this project was essentially political. Mr. Dollard's emphatic denial of the partisan socialistic character of the conclusions and recommendations of the Commission could mislead only those who had not read the work itself. He may attempt to identify the concepts of society contained in it as New Deal, and it is true that some of the socialist convictions disseminated by the document were shared by the fathers of the New Deal. But the overlapping of the socialist ideas of the Commission with the New Deal did not absolve the financial supporters of responsibility for this political undertaking. It is clearly desirable that foundations abstain from tampering with scientific research once a grant has been made to an unpolitical scientific organization. When, however, foundation money is offered for a program of politico-social nature, responsibility for its impact on society cannot be dodged by a semantic manipulation of terms such as socialism and New Deal. It is not the proper work of any foundation to promote the New Deal or any other political deal. There was consistency in the position of Mr. Dollard in defending the Commission's work, in supporting the selection of Stuart Chase and Dr. Myrdal, and in supporting the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences after its bias became well known. It seems fair to conclude that this consistency had at its base a sympathy for the political objectives which these activities furthered. One may wonder how it came about that foundations such as Carnegie and Rockefeller, controlled by trustees whose membership was overwhelmingly conservative, could lend themselves to the radical movement in education. One answer I have already given. They left decisions far too often to subordinate employees and to intermediary organizations. Another is that they were totally unaware of the pitfalls in the projects which they financed. Foundation apologists explain it differently. They say that these foundations made grants to respectable organizations and for respectable purposes. Having done so, they were obliged to keep their hands off. Therefore, they cannot be held accountable for what was produced. This justification of foundation trustees cannot be accepted by reasonable persons. As I have pointed out, there is an obligation to make sure that objectivity would accompany the operation of a proposed grant. What is equally important, there is an obligation to examine the product, and if it is found to lack objectivity, to take means to protect the public against its effects. The trustees of the Carnegie Corporation were acting in a field in which they had only limited competence when they authorized the heavy grant which produced the report of the Commission on Social Studies, granting, for the sake of argument, that they had the right, nevertheless, to take what risks to society were involved. Their failure to repudiate the result was a dereliction of duty. Upon learning that this product was an educational program for a socialist America, they might have offset whatever negligence or incompetence was connected with the creation of the project by organizing another project with at least equal financing to be made by a group of eminent educators who believed that our governmental and economic system was worthy of preservation and that the schools should not be used as political propaganda machines. Yes. So that would be the very sensible solutions and suggestions that he's offering here, really. It's to check the product for objectivity and see if there's a very clear bias or slant or ideology being put forward, which wouldn't be hard to detect, or fund to the tune of an equal amount a group of people to do the opposite study and argue the opposite case and then allow people to make their minds up. But that didn't happen. So I agree that the justification cannot be accepted by reasonable persons. Okay, we've got the next section, the radical educators. The report of the Rees Committee referred to numbers of the educational elite who supported and followed the plan laid down by the Carnegie-financed Commission on Social Studies. They were all, in various ways, connected with the educational complex supported by the millions of Rockefeller, Carnegie, and other foundations. Among the favorites of this foundation-supported radical movement in education was Professor George S. Counts, a leader in the project to use the schools to reform our political and social order. A pamphlet entitled A Call to the Teachers of the Nation, published by the Progressive Education Association, a tax-exempt organization largely supported by major foundations, was prepared by a committee of which Dr. Counts was chairman. It included this call, quote, "The progressive-minded teachers of the country must unite in a powerful organization, militantly devoted to the building of a better social order." And I'll just point out there's that word progressive again. "In the defense of its members against the ignorance of the masses." See, every now and again it comes through what they actually think about the rest of us. These these self-styled, self-anointed scientific gurus who are going to lead us all and manage everything and control it all from their little centralized ivory tower, right? The ignorance of the masses and the malevolence of the privileged. Such an organization would have to be equipped with the material resources, the talent, the legal talent, and the trained intelligence to wage successful war in the press, the courts, and the legislative chambers of the nation. To serve the teaching profession in this way should be one of the major purposes of the Progressive Education Association. So it's a war, right? Just like you can have a war on poverty, a war on drugs, a war against COVID. You're going to have a war on poverty. And every time you have a war on something, it just creates more of that thing that we had a war on, right? It's the way it works. Continuing. In one of his many radical books, Dare the School Build a New Social Order, John Day Company, 1932, Professor Counts said, quote, "that the teachers should deliberately reach for power and then make the most of their conquest is my firm conviction. To the extent that they are permitted to fashion the curriculum and the procedures of the school, they will definitely and positively influence the social attitudes, ideals, and behavior of the coming generation." He continued that a major concern of teachers should be opposing and checking the forces of social conservatism and reaction. Another professor of education named in the committee's report is Professor Theodore Brommeld of New York University, who minced no words in an article in Science and Society. Quote, "The thesis of this article is simply that liberal educators who look toward collectivism as a way out of our economic, political, and cultural morass must give more serious consideration than they have thus far to the methodology of Marx." Professor Brommeld, along with Dr. Gunnar Myrdal, was among those, quote, "experts cited by the Supreme Court in the Brown v. Board of Education segregation decision. These are strange authorities for the Supreme Court to rely upon. That many men such as these, politicians in educators' clothing, have achieved such prominence may be laid closely at the door of foundation support. Another of these educators gives us an idea of how close they come to totalitarianism. In an article in the Progressive Education magazine, Professor Norman Wolfel wrote, quote, "It might be necessary, paradoxically, for us to control our press, as the Russian press is controlled and as the Nazi press is controlled." There you are. Professor Wolfel felt strongly that the elite in the social sciences should reform the world. His Molders of the American Mind was dedicated to, quote, "The teachers of America, active sharers in the building of attitudes, may they collectively choose a destiny which honors only productive labor and promotes the ascendancy of the common man over the forces that make possible an economy of plenty." And, like so many of his kind, he is against tradition and against codes of morality. He wrote, quote, "The younger generation is on its own, and the last thing that would interest modern youth is the salvaging of the Christian tradition. The environmental controls which technologists have achieved and the operations by means of which workers earn their livelihood need no aid or sanction from God, nor any blessing from the church." Another quote, "In the minds of the men who think experimentally, America is conceived as having a destiny which bursts the old too obvious limitations of Christian religious sanctions and of capitalist profit economy." Elsewhere he wrote, "The call now is for the utmost capitalization of the discontent manifest among teachers for the benefit of revolutionary social goals. This means that all available energies of radically inclined leaders within the profession should be directed toward the building of a united radical front, warm collectivistic sentiment, and intelligent vision, propagated in clever and undisturbing manner by a few individual leaders, no longer suits the occasion." So he's calling for, sounds like he's calling for revolution, really. "The educators of whom we speak were leaders in their field, prominent in the councils of that most powerful organization of teachers, the National Education Association, which advertised itself as, quote, the only organization that represents or has the possibility of representing the great body of teachers in the United States." So there you go. You spread the ideology to the teachers, they spread it to the youth, and then, as they said earlier in the previous reading last Friday's, that they thought they could probably make a big change in a society in as little as 15 years, because that's how long it takes for the crop of young'uns to go through their 15,000 hours of compulsory mandatory schooling and to be indoctrinated with whatever the ideology is that they want to use to push through that change. So 15 years, it's a very short time. Think about how much has changed in the last 15 years. Certainly in the last 30 years, it's amazing, really. So we've got another section here on, I'm just going to see how much we got left in this chapter, so I can pick a good place to stop. So maybe another 11 pages or so, and then we can, yeah, well, that's good. So this next section is the Progressive Education Association. It's quite a short section, actually, just one page. Quotations already given from publications of the Progressive Education Association will indicate its character. Had it been devoted entirely to improving educational methods, it might have served a worthy purpose in education. Its leaders, however, were devoted not only to new methods of teaching, many of these methods, found to be entirely impractical, have since been abandoned, but also to following the thesis of the Commission on Social Studies that educators must use the schools to indoctrinate youth into an acceptance of collectivism. Its periodical, The Social Frontier, of October 1934, stated in an editorial that it accepts the analysis of the current epoch outlined in Conclusions and Recommendations, Report on the Social Studies of the Commission of the American Historical Association. Its sinews of war were supplied by foundations. up to 1943, says the Rees Committee report. Foundations had contributed $4.257 million to this association. What the aggregate figure is to date, I do not know. So that was up to 1943. This book was written in 1958, so another 15 years. During its long and intense career, the Progressive Education Association, which later changed its name to the American Education Fellowship. Fellowship, that sounds so good, doesn't it? Like the Fellowship of the Ring, just hobbits and elves and gnomes and golems, you know, all going on an adventure together. The American Education Fellowship created an unenviable record of leftist propaganda. Its publications, called at various times The Social Frontier, Frontiers of Democracy, and Progressive Education, contain a long record of attempts to suborn our educational system to an acceptance of radicalism. Typical is the issue of December the 15th, 1942, in which Professor Harold Rugg of Teachers College, Columbia University, contributed a call to arms. He announced the battle for consent. The consent was the consent of the people to change. His theory was simple. Education must be used to condition the people to accept social change. The social change was to be that, of course, espoused by Professor Rugg, involving a war against some of our most precious institutions. And I just looked over my shoulder there. I thought I'd get this book, just mention this one for anybody who's interested in more books on these kinds of topics. So on that idea there of how education must be used to condition the people to accept social change, you've got this book here, which is called Educate, Agitate, Organize by Patricia Pugh. And it's 100 years of Fabian socialism. But you just notice that it starts educate. So it's very critically important to these people and their plans and what they want to achieve that they get hold of education and get hold of the minds of the youth. And look, appropriately, it was first published in 1984. So that's another one you could get if you read The First Fabians by Norman and Jean Mackenzie. Then you could go for Patricia Pugh's book. But yes, education is a real key institution by which they seize control and affect change. Excuse me. So the next section is, this will probably be the last section we do tonight. My throat's getting a bit scratchy. The collectivist textbooks. Although we've only got 15 pages left for the rest of the chapter, so we'll see how we get on. But yes, let's get into the collectivist textbooks. There were plenty of teachers ready to follow the lead of the American Historical Association's Commission on Social Studies, and their effects extended into all aspects of education. New textbooks were required to take the place of the standard and objective works used in the schools. These new books could be used to indoctrinate the students, to give them the pathological view of their country upon which sentiment for collectivism could be built. Yeah, because remember, a lot of these people, they'll always blame nationalism. You see this as well when you're learning about, you know, the kind of Anglo-American establishment. Nationalism is what causes all these wars. It's just people being proud of their nation, proud of their country. That's what keeps leading to these big conflicts that cause so much death and destruction and pain and torment, right? So we've got to get rid of nationalism, and that's always a push towards collectivism whenever you hear that kind of rhetoric about how terrible nationalism is. And nowadays the bogeyman is populism, right? I was talking in my Telegram group about this. I was like, what is populism? Because I don't know exactly what it is, but I hear the way people talk about it, and I get this feeling and this sense that, oh, I'm supposed to think populism is a really bad thing by the tone and the derogatory kind of way that people, you know, they almost spit when they say the word, right? Populism. It's like, this is the way it comes across. But what's the difference? Populism isn't populism, because to me, if I just like on the face of it, populism just means whoever's the most popular. And another way to measure the popularity is by voting, right? So whoever gets the most vote is the most popular. Therefore, isn't populism just democracy, right? Isn't that supposedly the good thing? So I don't know. I'm not very au fait with my isms, but apparently there is some difference between nationalism, populism. But anytime you hear those kind of things, patriotism, conservatism, when these are under attack, generally it's because collectivism is lurking in the shadows, ready to be suggested in their place. So back to the text. But sorry, I just I thought that was a really good phrase. Pathological view of their country. You know, and a good example of this, I've mentioned it before, but if you go to Vietnam, where my wife's from, it's very, you see the Vietnamese flag, it's everywhere, on balconies, on T-shirts, on hats. It's all over the place. People are really proud. They've got this nationalism. They're proud of their country and the history, and they care about having children and preserving the culture, and they're very in line, right? But what we get here in England, when you see the Union Jack or the St. George's Cross, it's associated with racism and bigotry. It's associated with far-right extremism, and people have to fight to get these flags up because, you know, they're painted as a symbol of aggressive, threatening attitudes towards minorities. So in England, it's a perfect example of how we've got this pathological view of our country now, and the flag is the perfect way to measure that, right? If you are allowed to fly your flag with pride, and I know a flag's just a symbol, and it's another tool by which we are manipulated. I get that, but my point is that why is it okay in one place to do it and not in another place? Well, one place, you're being indoctrinated to have a pathological view of your country. Why? Multiculturalism's coming in. We're shipping lots of people in from other places that aren't necessarily compatible with your culture and your history and your religious institutions and your values and all that other stuff, right? We're shipping a lot of people in. So if you're nationalistic and proud of your country, then it's going to be problems, right? You're going to be less willing to accept all these people that we're shipping in for whatever reason. So we've got to implant this pathological view of your country first, soften you up a little bit so that you won't kick up too much of a fuss and push back in any meaningful way and stop it from happening as you watch demographics transform, towns, villages, places you grew up be completely transformed and beyond all recognition by a culture that is alien, right? I'm obviously not talking about little green men aliens, but the word for it is alien. When the dress is different, the language is different, the food's different, the behaviors, the expectations, the gender roles, all that kind of stuff is totally different. It's alien to your culture. A pathological view of your country helps this kind of agenda be rolled out without as much resistance. Okay, so good phrase to remember right there. Let's get back to it. The writer of a conservative or classic textbook has difficulty getting the funds to enable him to produce his work. At best, he must rely on an advance from a publisher, and it's rarely that even a slim one might be forthcoming. In contrast, a foundation-supported textbook writer, as a rule, can apply a substantial part of his time or all of it to his writing. Moreover, the very fact of foundation support or the support of an intermediary distributing organization for his project and the consequent inference of approval will create a favorable climate of opinion for the acceptance of his work by schools. At least before the recent congressional investigations, radical writers found it a simple matter to get foundation bounty. Under the influence of cliques in the world of teaching, the schools in the United States were flooded with books which disparaged the free enterprise system and American traditions. The notorious Rugg textbooks were of this class. They were prepared by Professor Harold Rugg, who began in the Lincoln Experimental School, financed by Rockefeller Foundations, to issue pamphlets which grew into this series of textbooks. 5 million copies of the books were poured into American schools up to 1940. How many since, I do not know. They were finally banned from the schools in the state of California after a panel of competent men appointed by the San Francisco Board of Education unanimously held them reprehensible. One of the reasons given by this panel was that these books promoted the thesis that, quote, "It is one of the functions of the schools, indeed it appears at the time to be the chief function, to plan the future of society. From this view we emphatically dissent." The panel's report continued, quote, "Moreover, the books contain a constant emphasis on our national defects. Certainly we should think it a great mistake to picture our nation as perfect or flawless either in its past or in its present. But," and that, just to remind people of the Truth Stream Media video, because this is exactly what they're talking about, and this is exactly what this executive order has demanded, right? The Trump's put through. The executive order says you got to take down everything which might point out the imperfections or the flaws in American people in the past. So it's just very synchronistic and good timing that we're reading this section with these quotes. Because as they're saying here, it's not about we've got this perfect, flawless history and we're amazing and we have to be proud. And, no, you got to look at it warts and all. But you learn history so you can avoid those things happening again. If you start erasing history, it's because those things that happened, those crimes that were committed, those atrocities, somebody's planning on doing those again. And you can't point to say, look, we tried this happened before and it was terrible, and look at all, and we've got these monuments and we've got these exhibits to remember what happened before. No, once they're wiped out, down the memory hole, it's 1984, and people can be more easily led down the path to pain and suffering and struggle and strife and murder and death and all that other stuff. So Truth Stream Media's most recent video is very, very good, very much worth spending time on. I'll go back to this quote. I'll do it again. "Certainly we should think it a great mistake to picture our nation as perfect or flawless either in the past or in the present. But it is our conviction that these books give a decidedly distorted impression through overstressing weaknesses and injustice. They therefore tend to weaken the student's love for his country, respect for its past, and confidence in its future." Yes, paving the way for a one world system, right? Global citizens, and never being loyal to your country, because especially, and this doesn't apply everywhere, this has been rolled out in the countries that are being deindustrialized, a la Brzezinski's Technotronic era and Club of Rome's first global revolution, right? The countries that are being deindustrialized, the countries that are being brought down a few pegs while they're simultaneously funding the development of some other countries to bring them up a few pegs, and they're going to meet in the middle. These are the countries that have been indoctrinated with this pathology against their own country and history and race, yeah, I think that's it. Country, race, history, culture. So, Mr. McKinnon, one of the panel, added that these books denied moral law, that Professor Rugg was trying to achieve, quote, "a social reconstruction through education," and that they promoted change as apparently desirable in itself, an experiment in government, education, economics, and family life as of paramount importance. Yeah, so change for change's sake. Change is always good. It's progress, it's change. And let's experiment and try different things and try new things and just never stop changing and adjusting and progressing and experimenting. But you can only buy into this if you are unaware that there's a plan that all these experiments and changes and nudges are designed to push you closer to, right? Someone else's plan, someone's long-term plan. Alan Watt would call it the business plan that we're living through. Change and experimentation and progress sounds really good if you're unaware of these very high-level architects of civilization and society and systems, and where they want to take everybody. This is why it's good to learn, study, read, and get up to speed on how reality really works. A little quote. Throughout the books, he said, runs an anti-religious bias as well. Yes, out with religion. Because religion tends to give you a framework and a foundation for objective morality. And that needs to be gotten rid of. Let us take a closer look at Professor Rugg. In his book, Great Technology, Rugg, who had visited China the previous year on a mission to prepare a social reconstruction and education project for that country, said, quote, "Can independent ways of living be carried on any longer on an irresponsible competitive basis? Must not central public control be imposed on the warring, self-aggrandizing captains of industry? Can this control be set up with the consent of a large minority of the people quickly enough to forestall the imposition of dictatorship either by business leaders or by an outraged proletarian agriculture bloc which seems imminent?" He asked these questions not about China, but about the United States. Millions of textbooks written by this man were used at one time in our country. In his Great Technology, his Social Chaos and the Public Mind, and other works, he advocated social change. Following the recommendations of the Carnegie-financed Commission on the Social Studies, he suggested that such change required the indoctrination of our youth through the schools. He recommended that social science be the core of school curriculum to bring about a climate of opinion favorable to his philosophy. So social science at the heart of it has relativism, and then you need to put relativism into the minds of the students by way of the curriculum so that they will rebel and react and throw out the things that their parents might be trying to pass on to them, the traditions, the old ways of doing things. This is how you turn younger generations against older generations. Through the efforts of this and other followers of the recommendations, and through the operation of the patronage network of Teachers College of Columbia University, the educational philosophy which Professor Rugg espoused soon pervaded the American school system. This philosophy involves, quote, implementing an expectancy of change, picturing the America of today as a failure, disparaging the American Constitution and the motives of the founders of the Republic, and presenting a new social order. Professor Rugg characteristically advocated production for use, not for profit, that old socialist slogan, reconstruction of the national economic system to provide for central controls, there you go, centralization, to guarantee a stable and high minimum living for all, division of the social income so as to guarantee at least a 10 times 1929 minimum for all, measuring wages by some yardstick of purchasing power, re-education of the parasitic middleman in our economy and his reassignment to productive work, recognition that educators are a group vastly superior to that of a priesthood or of any other selected social class. And that's a quote. What a quote indeed. Educators are a group vastly superior to that of a priesthood or of any other selected social class. So the interesting comparison there is the priesthood. The old authority figures who could interpret the word of God, and they alone could tell you what it said in holy books, right, and the scriptures. Now, it's the educators and the scientists who are the new priesthood of this scientism system. Our task, he said, was to create swiftly a compact body of minority opinion for the scientific reconstruction of our social order. This body of opinion must be made articulate and be brought to bear insistently upon the dictators of legislative and executive action. The alternative to this extension of democracy is revolution. In 1941, Professor Rugg denied vehemently that he was a socialist or that he had ever been one. However, in 1936, he had been a member of a committee of 500 supporting the socialist candidacy of Norman Thomas. He was a director of the League for Industrial Democracy in 1934 to 35, but no collateral evidence of his political position is necessary to disclose his socialist point of view. He has stated it himself in his numerous writings. His employment of the socialist plank, production for use, not for profit, is quite enough to identify him. Yeah, it's funny that he would deny it when he's just when he's just giving you the talking points in his own writings and books. A group of liberal educators defended the Rugg textbooks. Prominent among these was Professor Robert S. Lind, a former permanent secretary of the Social Science Research Council. Himself an advocate of change towards socialism, Professor Rugg was also defended by a number of members of the Committee on Textbooks of the American Committee for Democracy and Intellectual Freedom. The money for Professor Rugg's 6 textbooks came indirectly from Rockefeller Foundation grants to the Lincoln School and Teachers College. While foundations approached in 1922 had refused direct support of the pamphlets, Professor Rugg reports that preliminary estimates set the amount of money required at a sum far beyond that which the Lincoln School or Teachers College could be asked to supply. They did, however, support the project in other and altogether indispensable ways. In fact, if they had not given it an institutional connection and a home, no such undertaking could have been started. Even their financial contribution, however, was considerable. It consisted of the writer's salary as educational psychologist in the school and as professor of education in the college, the salary of his secretary, and an allowance for a part-time assistant during several years. Mr. Aaron Sargent also testified in detail regarding the Building America textbook series, which the Reese Committee report characterized as another attempt by radical educators financed by foundations to suborn the schools. It was the General Education Board, a Rockefeller Foundation, which provided over $50,000 for the production of these books, taken over and intensively promoted by the National Education Association. The state of California barred these books also from its schools. After a legislative committee, the Dilworth Committee, investigated and concluded in its report that they were subtle attempts to play up Marxism and to destroy our traditions. Mr. Sargent pointed out that there had been a blackout in history teaching in California for about 12 years. During this time, no history textbooks were provided by the Department of Education, which was operating under the radical devised scheme of social studies. After an investigation, history books were again furnished, as the law required. In the meantime, the Building America books largely took their place, giving children distorted facts and consciously directed misinformation regarding our history and our society. The report of the Dilworth Committee, as a result of which the California legislature refused any appropriation for the purchase of Building America textbooks, concluded that these books do not present a true historical background of American history and progress, and that the cartoons and pictures appearing in said books belittle American statesmen who have been upheld as heroes of American tradition and have been idealized by the American people. Yet on the other hand, the Building America series glamorizes Russian statesmen and is replete with pictures which do great credit to these leaders of Russian thought. The report goes on to say that the books contain purposely distorted references favoring communism and life in Soviet Russia in preference to the life led by Americans. In this regard, the committee felt that pictures representing conditions of starvation among American families hardly presented a true picture of family life in America. When children in the 7th and 8th grades, the committee said, compare such pictures With the illustrations of Russian family life, they will conclude that family life in Russia is equal or even preferable to that in the United States. It was found that the books paint present economic and social conditions in America in an unfavorable light and have the opportunity to propagandize class warfare and class distinction. It was concluded further that the texts present a materialistic picture of government and economy in America and in the world, rather than the idealism of the American way of life. Specific criticism was made of the reference books listed in the Building America pamphlets as guides to additional information. These recommended books were found to be highly biased and likely to indoctrinate pupils in a manner contrary to the best traditions of America. The editors and authors of the Building America series were careful enough to present both sides of various problems and questions. This was done, however, in most instances, in a manner strongly indicating editorial bias in favor of socialist measures and ideas, a preference emphasized by the editors who selected the illustrations. The pictures were likely to impress children even more than the text itself, and were selected clearly to arouse doubts about American institutions and American historical figures. Yeah, it's mind-blowing, isn't it, that this was done. But it shows you the power of schools, schooling, and you, unless your children are bringing home their textbooks and showing you what's in them, you have no idea what indoctrination they're being subject to, and this is how it's done. Pictures in textbooks. These days, they're probably getting shown, videos. There's probably whole online websites and platforms full of propaganda, misinformation, subversive information, all loaded with ideology. And it's going to have been even more perfected in the intervening decades. Next bit. The pamphlet about Russia contains numerous propaganda pictures from Soviet information sources. The objectivity of the authors may be illustrated by their, and that's objectivity in inverted commas there. The, quote, objectivity of the authors may be illustrated by their statement, quote, the Russians liked our system of government no better than we liked theirs. This implies that there is much to be said on both sides. It also assumes an absurdity, that the suppressed Russians, unable to speak their minds, favor the system which has been imposed on them. But that's the kind of logical fallacy that children will not be able to pick up on. They won't be able to see that it's an absurdity and a sort of a contradiction. The Bolshevik Revolution, continuing, and regime are presented as a blessing to the Russian people. In the description of the long road which led to communism, there is not one word of fact or criticism regarding the murderous Red Terror of 1917 and 1918, or the treachery of communism in destroying the hopes of Russia's democratic revolutionaries. Conditions in Russia are presented wholly in terms of Soviet apology. There is a chapter on making the state safe for socialism, including this, quote, probably no other nation ever made such rapid strides in extending educational opportunities for the people. The depicted image of social progress contains no word of reference to the obliteration of freedom, to the concentration camps, to the purges, and to the worldwide Moscow-directed subversive activities. Pictures of everyday Soviet life present scenes in a church. Oh, so the Soviets are allowed religion. And it's shown as a good thing. Pictures present scenes in a church, in art galleries, in concert halls, and at a meeting of a Soviet trade union, the whole gamut of red propaganda in the period. As more consumer goods were produced and the scheme for buying and selling improved, it said, the wants of consumers were more satisfied. There is no mention, however, of the actual tragic dearth of consumer goods even before the German attack. There is nowhere a picture of the privation of the Russian people under communism. Nor is this all. But wait, there's more. Fearful lest statements by outsiders might disillusion the child readers of these books about Russia, the authors are careful to prepare a defense. Quote, some writers mention some use of force by the government to attain its ends. I have emphasized the double use of some. Yes, some writers mention a denial of the right to strike or protest. Secret police, the absolute power of one man over the lives of the people, and the lack of any civil liberties in the American sense of the word. But the authors imply that there is another sense, a Soviet sense of civil liberties. The Russians, say the authors, have more self-government than they have ever had before. The new Russians call their dictatorship the democracy of the working classes. There is no more discrimination against certain races and creeds, etc., etc., etc. The authors have the effrontery to say that, quote, rights that mean so much to Americans, freedom of assembly and the press, are little missed in Russia. To them, the Russians, the new leadership is better than the old. They indicate also that though it does not appeal to Americans, the Russian system is here to stay. History of Propaganda says, hugely important part of the book. Destruction of America under the title of Building America. Classic progress. Yeah. They do a lot of that inversion, a lot of that opposite thing. You know, as a rule of thumb, just flip it, just invert it, and you'll be a bit closer to the truth, right? Continuing, the Dilworth report said of the book on China, quote, this book is peculiarly useful to the communists as a medium to further disseminate the current party line concerning conditions in China. The pamphlet on civil liberties contains pictures of Sacco and Vanzetti of the Scopes trial, of Browder, of the Scottsboro Negroes, of strike riots being subdued. The whole collection, in spite of its pretended objectivity, is loaded with liberal propaganda. It is a reminder of the Aesopian language used by communists in their communication system. It is difficult to believe that the Rockefeller Foundation and the National Education Association could have supported these textbooks. But the fact is that Rockefeller financed them and the NEA promoted them very widely. They were still in use in some parts of the country at the time of the Reese Committee investigation. Another foundation-supported piece of, quote, education literature is a pamphlet entitled The American Way of Business. It was one of a series prepared by the National Association of Secondary School Principals and the National Council for Social Studies, both branches of the National Education Association. Under a grant from the Rockefeller General Education Board to provide teachers with source material on some social problems. Who wrote it? Oscar Lange and Abba P. Lerner. Mr. Lange will be remembered as the professor at the University of Chicago when Dr. Hutchins was its president, who later renounced his American citizenship to accept appointment as the ambassador to the United Nations from communist Poland. Mr. Lerner has been a collectivist for a long time. The book gives our children such ideas as these. Public enterprise must become a major constituent of our economy if we are really going to have economic prosperity. It is necessary to have public ownership of banking and credit, investment banks and insurance companies. It is necessary to have public ownership of monopolistic key industries. It is necessary to have public ownership of basic natural resources, mines, oil fields, timber, coal, etc., in order to ensure that the public corporations act in accordance with the competitive rules of the game. A special economic court, enjoying the same independence as the courts of justice, might be established, and that the economic court be given the power to repeal any rules of Congress, of legislatures, or of the municipal councils. These texts, financed by the Rockefeller Foundation and distributed by the National Education Association, must have influenced the thinking of hundreds of thousands of defenseless young Americans. They may well have contributed to the recent philosophy of reckless public spending and overgrowth of government. These books I have mentioned are but a few examples of what has happened to teaching materials in our schools and colleges. Professor E. Merrill Root gives a quick survey of this development in his Collectivism on the Campus, in which he includes a chapter entitled The State Liberals, Their Textbooks. The rise of communism, he says, has produced a strange result among the textbook writers. Conservatism is not even given house room. Communism is disliked, but the only alternative offered is some such appeasement as welfarism or Fabian socialism. He quotes Professor David McCord Wright of McGill University. What sometimes happens, for instance, in economics courses is that the Marxian indictment is presented, followed by some sort of social democratic or heavily interventionist answer, and that the capitalist case never gets heard at all. The vast majority of textbooks now used in colleges and schools on subjects in which a political slant could be given are heavily slanted to the left. Surprise, surprise. This was demonstrated by Professor A. H. Hobbs of the University of Pennsylvania, whose work in disclosing some of the vices and foibles of modern sociology earned for him martyrdom in his career. In his analysis of a great number of sociology textbooks in his book, The Claims of Sociology, A Critique of Textbooks, he found, quote, inclusion of a chapter on social change is an integral part of the system of sociology textbooks. Such chapters are designed to leave students with favorable final impressions about the subject. After depressing the student with portrayals of the amount of unemployment, poverty, crime, vice, and slums, after shocking him with descriptions of the insidious war propaganda and the horrors of war, after creating in him qualms about the amount of social disorganization and raising him to rebellion against the dead hand of the past upon society, the author of contemporary texts must assuage him. Mitigation of the depressive effects of horrendous description of social evils is attained in a chapter which is constructive, optimistic, positive, and looking beyond social defects of the present toward a bright future which we can make for ourselves in Outlook. In 70 out of 83 texts, Dr. Hobbs found sections devoted to social change. There is agreement that traditions, conventions, and social inertia are the principal obstacles to social progress. Authors in sociology texts increasingly emphasize economic security as a fundamental social value and the principal goal toward which social change should be focused. 27 textbook authors call for the use of the social sciences in a program of social planning. As used in these texts, the term planning or social engineering involves control of social processes by long-range subjection of society to guidance by social scientists. So it's the rule by experts. Dr. Hobbs formulates the attitudes of the majority of the sociology textbooks currently in use with these words, quote, educational practices and principles which involve discipline or drill, and the teaching of traditional beliefs about the government, the family, or the economic system are inefficient and harmful. These should be replaced by including educational programs which will train students to think for themselves and to behave only in accordance with self-derived principles of rationality. Independent thinking will emancipate student personalities from the stultifying effects of traditional beliefs, enable them to adjust to existing social situations and to promote social change. Democracy is highly desirable, but the present form of government is not democratic, principally because business interests exert too much control over it. Increased government control over business and industry is the most important step toward attainment of the political ends, but such controls constitute only one phase of broader social planning. Maldistribution of wealth and income and unemployment are the outstanding characteristics of our social system. It is no wonder that some of our citizens, facing the political character of so much of what purports to be sociological teaching, have difficulty distinguishing among the terms sociology, the social sciences, and socialism. I'm just going to pause there to take a sip of my tea. Yeah, that's it. Sociology, socialism, social sciences. Social, it sounds good. You're sociable, aren't you? You're a social person. You like people. And that's the implication baked into that word there. It's like, if you're not, if you don't like social planning and sociology and socialism, what are you? Some sort of misanthrope? Some sort of, do you hate people? And that's what it's tied. It's like, the idea, the idea is that individualism is selfish. You only care about yourself. You only care about, if you're not socialist, then you must be self-centered narcissist who doesn't care a damn about anybody else and only wants to get more for yourself. That's the implication. So this is why it appeals to the idealism of the young and the youth, and this is why they target the youth with textbooks, and why the foundations fund the textbooks which they know are going to influence and impact the youth. It's quite obvious when you see it. And you have an excellent book like this to explain it. So we've got a final section coming up, which is called Reference Works. Oh no, there's another bit about Sloan Foundations. And then we're at the end of the chapter, which is good because my voice is starting to struggle. But I think it's worth finishing this chapter. So, section on reference works. To both teacher and student, reference works are important instruments in the educational process. We've already seen that the all-important Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, created under Foundation financing, was heavily slanted toward radicalism. Let us look at another reference work, the Encyclopedia Americana. Financed by the Rockefeller Foundation, both Columbia University and Cornell University established courses described as an intensive study of contemporary Russian civilization. It was chiefly to the staffs of these projects that the editors of the Encyclopedia Americana turned to write its section on Soviet Russia. A dramatis personae of this venture included such deeply biased workers as these: Sir Bernard Paris, who opposed American help to Greece and Turkey and supported the claim of Soviet Russia to Constantinople; Corliss Lamont, whose record of pro-communism needs no elaboration; Harriet L. Moore, named by Louis Boudens as a member of the Communist Party; Vladimir D. Kazakovich, one of the editors of Science and Society, a Marxist quarterly, a frequent contributor to Soviet Russia, a pro-communist publication. Mr. Kazakovich left the United States in 1949 after exposure as a Soviet agent. And others of very doubtful objectivity. When the work was completed, Cornell University was so pleased with it that, with the permission of the encyclopedia, it converted the Russian section into a textbook, USSR, which was used at Cornell until 1954. In the meantime, many other colleges and universities had adopted it, including Columbia, Rutgers, Swarthmore, Chicago, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Southern California, Washington, and Yale. At least 15 out of 20 contributors were, according to Professor Warren S. Walsh of Syracuse University, pro-Soviet in varying degrees. About one-third of the material in USSR was prepared by Mr. Kazakovich. Then he could have been selected for this work. That he could have been selected for this work was truly amazing. Professor E. Merrill Root, in his Collectivism on the Campus, quotes these words from Mr. Kazakovich, appearing on February the 27th, 1940 in Ruski Golos. Quote, "The crocodiles of imperialism will continue to swallow everything they get. For the neutral countries today, the English crocodile is more dangerous than the German one. In order to prevent the lawlessness of this crocodile, you've got to drive a pole into the back of its neck." Professor Root continues, quote, "Perhaps this chaste language seemed scholarly to the scholars of Cornell, for they invited Kazakovich to lecture on the campus during the summer. His lectures became a part of the Encyclopedia Americana as he was an expert in a special field and of USSR. This reminds me of Fearful Master and everything we learned in here about the kinds of people who ended up working in the United Nations and how many of them were communists and how many of those roles in the United Nations were always held by communists and communist sympathizers. Certain roles have never been occupied by anyone who wasn't an outright and open and affiliated communist, right? So it just reminds me of that, this little anecdote here about Kazakovich. Continuing, Professor Roman Schmalstocky of Marquette University has said of USSR that it is justly called a, quote, fellow traveling guide to the Soviet Union. It may, of course, be true that the Rockefeller Foundation bears no direct responsibility for what was produced. Perhaps the projects which it financed were wholly desirable. Perhaps it was entirely the fault of Columbia and Cornell universities that a strange collection of radicals and pro-communists were included on the staffs of the Russian projects, and the fault of Cornell that it did not recognize or become concerned over the biased nature of the book which it published. But the fact remains that it all came about through Rockefeller financing. If this is the nature of that risk-taking, which many foundation executives maintain is the duty of the modern foundation, something is badly wrong somewhere. I ask again, is it not the duty of a foundation which takes such risks to examine the results and to repudiate them if they have been unfortunate? As far as I know, the Rockefeller Foundation has done nothing to inform the public that it is not in sympathy with what its financing produced in this instance or in any other. Here indeed is a strange situation. Foundations consider themselves entitled to take credit for the outcome of a grant, the results of which are socially approved. On the other hand, when the grant has failed, or if the product meets with disapprobation or is seriously questionable, then responsibility is shifted to the recipient of the grant. That's convenient, isn't it? Nice little system there. This is an odd interpretation of the venture capital concept. We are entitled to take political risks with the tax-exempt money we administer, say foundation managers. If the project turns out safely, it is to our credit. If the risk turns out to have been too great, or if the result is an unhappy one, that is not our fault, and we have no responsibility either to inform the public of the error or to take any steps to correct the injury done. Very, very good, convenient, handy little system for sure. All right, this is going to be our penultimate section for this chapter. It's the Citizens Education Project. The Citizens Education Project was created at Teachers College of Columbia University under financing far exceeding $1 million provided by the Carnegie Corporation. That the project was carried on with considerable bias to the left is unquestionable. There arises then the question of responsibility. The committee report stated that it was unable, without further inquiry, to determine whether this was the fault or the intention of either the project managers or of the Carnegie Foundation. It continued its comment, however, as follows, quote, "We do, however, see responsibility lodged with the Carnegie Corporation. It may not have had the duty to supervise the project or to direct it in transit. This may have even been unwise. But as the project represented a substantial investment of public money, and its impact on society could be very heavy, it seems clearly to have been the duty of Carnegie to examine what had been done and to repudiate it if it was against the public interest. This, as far as we know, Carnegie did not do." What was the objective of this project? To educate for better citizenship. How was this to be accomplished? One of its chief products was a card index file. The cards summarized books, articles, films, etc., being arranged topically so that teachers could use the files in teaching citizenship. The files were sold to schools at nominal cost. In essence, this was canned material for teachers. The teachers did not have to read a book, He or she could just look in the card file and read a quick digest prepared by the project. There is some doubt that this method of teaching through canned media is desirable. Granting that it might be, the greatest objectivity would have to be used in preparing the digests and comments on the cards, as well as the selection of items to be included, as the committee put it. Even those who believe in canned education cannot defend the slant with which this card system was devised, unless they believe that education should not be unbiased, but should be directed toward selected political ends and radical ones at that. I think we all know what's coming here, don't we? The committee report gave several out of many examples of the radical slant. Books were included which could not be reasonably defended as proper for recommendation to school children, books by communists and pro-communists. Radical books were given approbation. Conservative books were given the doubtful treatment. Let me give one illustration. The Road to Serfdom by Frederick A. Hayek, a valuable commentary on the fallacies of socialism, is called strongly opinionated. In contrast, the Building America textbooks, to which I have earlier referred, are described as factual ideals and concepts of democracy. Many conservative books of importance were not even listed. But A Mask for Privilege by Carrie McWilliams was described as historical, descriptive. Mr. McWilliams' record of Communist Front associations consume 4 pages of the Rees Committee report. Rich Land, Poor Land by Stuart Chase, whose collectivist position has been described earlier, was called descriptive, factual, illustrative. Building for Peace at Home and Abroad by Maxwell Stewart, whose Communist Front associations consume about 5 pages of the Rees Committee report, was labelled factual, dramatic. And Howard Fast's The American was called historical, bibliographical. Mr. Fast's communist associations occupy 4 pages of the committee report. He has since renounced the party, so we have a happy ending there for good old Howard Fast. All right, final section of this chapter, and then we will wrap it up for today. Several Sloan Foundation projects. The Sloan Foundation, created in 1934, has had its regrettable moments. Its intention seems to have been to specialize in economic education and to seek truth through sound scholarship, but it supported the heavily left-slanted Chicago Roundtable broadcasts to the tune of $35,000 and the public affairs pamphlets with $72,000. It supported a motion picture-making program at New York University, which concentrated on presenting the darkest image of the backward hinterlands of the South, possibly to arouse compassion, but more likely for propaganda purposes. It deserves credit for having supported the sound economic teaching program of Harding College. Whether it merits credit for having contributed $19,000 to the Lincoln School at Columbia University is questionable. The Public Affairs Committee was directed by Maxwell Stewart, a one-time editor of the communist English-language newspaper Moscow News. Several witnesses have called Mr. Stewart a communist, but we do not know what his party allegiances were during his more than a decade of management of the public affairs pamphlets. They had a circulation of millions of copies among high school and college students, among libraries, adult education groups, and government employees. Among the members of the board of directors of this publishing organization were such well-known, quote, liberals as Lyman Bryson, Luther Gulick, and Ordway Teed. We find these names also: Frederick Vanderbilt Field, Mark Starr, and Harry W. Laidler, all of whom may be classed as extreme leftists. The presence of these names on the roster of any organization should have indicated to the Sloan trustees what the publishing venture was all about. Among the authors of the pamphlets we find Louis Adamick, James G. Patton, Maxwell Stewart, and E.C. Lindemann. Stewart wrote by far the largest number of the approximately 100 pamphlets. The style of these books is reminiscent of the Building America textbooks. They show a pretense of objectivity, But in giving both sides of an issue, they leave no doubt that they believe the left side is sound. If my information is correct, that the Sloan Foundation reorganized its management and deposed those who were responsible for its leftist orientation, there is ground for rejoicing and for hope that other foundations whose trustees have lacked alertness in the past may follow suit. Little bit of a happy ending about the Sloan Foundation there. At the end of chapter 5, which I think was a very good one, Foundations and Radicalism in Education. Good stuff. So yeah, a bit of a happy ending there. Sloan Foundation, seeing the bias, seeing the clear, overt slant to all the projects and people that it was funding, sacked a bunch of people and got some new leaders. I can't imagine that happens very often, if at all, in any of the other foundations, because, as he said there, they had this kind of plausible deniability. You know, if the results were good, yeah, we'll claim that. We'll say, wow, look at the wonderful things we've done. And if the results were disparaged or made people angry or unhappy, then we just kind of don't mention it and put the blame on the person, the group that received the grant. So there you go. That's another chapter on the record of foundations, their power and influence. I think that's a really good one. We're seeing how the sausage is made, and the foundations are such a critically important piece of the power structure that we have been born into, that was built and created and designed and funded way before we were born. So it's an old system. It's been in existence for a long time, which makes understanding it a little harder. But the thing that I still keep finding quite amazing is how old this book is. Not that it's old, but like 1958. So what I always keep saying and thinking is that all the problems have been known, they've been foreseen, we've been warned. People have written the books and explained this is where it's going, this is what's going to happen. And yet it's all just panned out that way and gone that way regardless of all the books, regardless of the warnings, the investigations, the committees. I think History of Propaganda, you told me that these committees and commissions, they don't really have any teeth. So they can do their investigation and gather the documents and put the report together, but then nothing has to be done afterwards, right? They just submit the report and people go, oh no, yeah, that's terrible, oh dear. And then nothing changes and nobody gets held to account. Nothing is corrected. No sanctions or injunctions are placed upon the organizations. They just carry on, right? So it's good at least because the investigation can be done and the information can be recorded, communicated. We get access to it, but it doesn't on its own change anything, sadly. And foundations are still popular vehicles for social change, for ideological amplification, for tax evasion, for reputation laundering, and all the things that they do. Have any of them done any good? Yes, of course. I'm sure they have. But like any good scam or any good lie or any good con, there has to be some good, some truth, something believable, some benefit mixed in there, right? Because otherwise it would be too obvious. The scam and the con would not be successful. So there has to be a little bait, a little bit of sugar to make, to go with the medicine. This is how these things work. So I'm sure there are foundations out there that you can point to and say, well, this one did a good bit of work and look at the benefits and look that it had. The question is like, on the whole, what about the biggest ones, the ones with the most money, the ones with the most funding, the ones with the biggest, with the most clout? What are they up to? Where do they come from? What's their history? What have they been involved in? We're learning about it in this book. We might have hit the halfway point. Let's have a look. Not quite, but, we're getting there. We're almost at the halfway point now. Still very much looking forward to the chapter on internationalism. And it's the chapter after the next one. Yeah, so next chapter is Revolution is Nearly Accomplished. And then chapter 7 is Foundation Impact on Foreign Policy. That's the one I'm really looking forward to. It's only 18 pages, actually. Whereas the one we did today was 31 pages. But it's not all about size, is it? So let's have a review of the comments, and then we will wrap it up. And I'll go about our business. Heidi says, my Americana set has a huge entry on theosophy. Oh, you've got a set of these. Is that like an encyclopedia set, or I'm not sure about Americana. The conservative donor class is blissfully oblivious to their own engineering, says Heidi. Frank says, brilliant, Nick. Another enjoyable and educational chapter, onward and upward. Thank you. I'm glad you liked it. Franz Yuan says, thanks, Nick. Good chapter. Very informative. Very welcome. Heidi, you're very welcome. History of Propaganda says, Ordway Teed is a founder. Howard Scott's technocracy movement. Oh, really? See Bureau of Industrial Research and Bureau of Industrial Audit. That is the founding of the technocracy. Very good work. Thank you. It's been great to have you here, History of Propaganda. I think I'm right in saying your name's Dwayne, but I don't want to get it wrong. But I've said it now, so hopefully I got that right. But it's good to have you here, and adding the context and the extra information into the chat is good indeed. I like it when it's a sort of collaborative effort. People are asking questions and helping each other out. It makes it very, not all about me and my sore throat. So yeah, another good chapter, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. And I enjoyed that very much. Definitely one of my favorite books we've read on the channel. So that's it. Let's wrap it up. Let's call it a night. allmylinks.com/Hayes Reviews, pinned at the top of the chat, or at the bottom of the chat now. They've moved where the pinned comment goes. So it's at the bottom of the chat on YouTube. It's at the top on Rumble. But you can find everything you need there to support or get in touch, or the things that I do, the places I hang out online. Subscribe, follow, like, comment, share. All that stuff can be done at allmylinks.com/Hayes Reviews. You can check out the ultimate reading list that I put together, which is a full book list of every book in my library. It's actually out of date already because I've received a couple of more books this week, so I need to update it at some point. But it's pretty much every single book in my library, right? In one list for free PDF download, ultimatereadinglist.com. You can grab that. And you can shoot me an email at nick@hayesreviews.com. I like hearing from people. Maybe you can suggest an author or a book or a project or ways that I can make this better, or feedback or anything, really. Just it's good to hear from people. It's good to be in touch with like-minded people who are paying attention to these things and learning about them. It helps keep us sane. It helps keep us motivated to push on when we are being ground down by these insane psychopathic systems of control and manipulation and all the other nasty stuff that they do, right? So, yes, I love hearing from people, and, it's good to reach out and connect. So, nick@hayesreviews.com is my email address if you feel like doing that. I think that is it. That is all my links. They're at the bottom of the screen there anyway, so you don't need me to read them out. But just for anybody who's listening and not watching, I'll do it for their benefit. Doris, you're very welcome. Thank you for saying thank you, and thank you for tuning in. I appreciate it. Right, I'm gonna get out of here. I'll play you out with a little bit of guitar music as usual on the outro there. I appreciate you all being here. I feel like tonight was a good workout, almost 3 hours. So we definitely put in a shift, but I enjoyed some of the rants and good information from a fantastic book that we are very blessed indeed to be able to read together. So have a lovely weekend. I'll be back. Will I be back next Friday? I will be back next Friday. We'll continue next Friday and see what else we can learn from the excellent Rene Wormser in his wonderful book, Foundations, Their Power and Influence. Take care, everybody. Hope you have a lovely week. Take excellent care of yourselves and each other. Spring is here. You know what that means? Poisoning pigeons in the park. It's a song by Tom Lehrer. Look it up. It's hilarious. Spring is here. Spring is here. Life is Skittles and life is beer. I think the loveliest time of the year is the spring. I do. Don't you? Of course you do. I won't spoil the rest of the song, but it's a good one. All right, everyone. Lovely to spend this time with you. Thank you very much. Take care and God bless.